Boker Tov, Haverim. Welcome, my friends. It's wonderful that you could join us. I'm here with my dear friend Al Jazeera, and we are hanging out to study our Torah portion for this week, which is Shemini. So, why is Al Jazeera here? Those of you who know me know that Robin and I spend a great deal of time watching owls. We have an owl box in our backyard, and every year we like to track uh, the nesting and the production of owlets, and seeing the owlets depart and hang out in our trees for a while and then disappear. It's one of our enthusiasms, and I extend that enthusiasm further by collecting owl objects. And I found Al Jazeera at a garage sale, and I'm sure he was originally intended to either protect a garden or protect an airfield, discourage other birds from gathering there, but I just like to have him around. He brings me comfort. The reason he's here is because our Torah portion this week is called Shemini, and a big part of Shemini is devoted to the animals you're permitted to eat and the much longer list of animals you are not permitted to eat. And this is an animal you are not permitted to eat. So this is a moment in which the intolerable is hanging out with the inedible. So I'm going to put Al Jazeera aside, and I'm going to go on and talk further about our Torah portion. So what happens in our Torah portion? Well, before we even get to kashrut, there's some big action going on, a narrative, and it consists of this: that the temple has been, or the Mishkan has been completed. There's been an 8-day dedication. It's time to make the first sacrifices. The first sacrifices are to be performed by the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. They both proceed in, but something goes terribly awry. And as a result, both of them are struck dead before the altar by flame. And what follows is the aftermath of all of this, and a brief discussion about further rules of the priesthood. And then we shift into the issues of kashrut, and that occupies the majority of the Torah portion. So, what are the big ideas happening in our Torah portion? Well, aside from kashrut, the first thing to note is the number 8. It's a sacred number. It's associated with the dedication of sacred spaces. We can see this. It's 8 days to dedicate the portable sanctuary. It took 8 days to dedicate Solomon's sanctuary, and of course, we recall that the rededication of the second temple under the Maccabees took 8 days, which is why we celebrate the 8-day holiday of Hanukkah. Hanukkah meaning dedication. Now, beyond that, what happens is this catastrophic death of these two young men, which reminds us that we should treat all ritual behaviors with great respect and care. Then we have the issue of how to comfort a mourner, which comes up between Aaron and Moses. And I think the final thing to say is that one should be clear-headed in one's Judaism, because one of the factors brought up after the fact was that priests should serve before the altar drunk. That should not serve before the altar drunk. They should serve before the altar sober. All right. So let's make our major focus. Our major focus is law and order. SVU. Bum bum. Right? SVU being sacrificial victim unit. So we have a mystery here, a murder mystery. And we want to know the where, when, how, who, and why. And the where is at the Mishkan. The when is at its first pilot sacrifices. The who are the two victims, and quite honestly, the prime suspect is God. And then there's the why. And that has puzzled rabbis for a long time. They've attempted to assign a moral rationale, that there was something flawed in both Aaron's sons that merited this punishment. The chief focus has been on the later instructions that the priest should be sober when he makes sacrifices. So maybe the rabbis conclude that the two young men had partied too hard at the dedication, came with still drunk or with hangovers to this ceremony, and died accordingly. It seems a disproportionate punishment from our perspective, and perhaps it would be a little, I don't know how much, a little more useful to think of it in terms of an electrician doing electrical work while drunk, or a plumber doing plumbing work while drunk. These are powerful things: indoor plumbing, electricity, the ability to channel fire inside of our homes. They make life so much better, and it's really good, but you have to treat it with respect. And if you get the ritual wrong, the results can be catastrophic. It can mean flood, it can mean fire, it can mean someone being electrocuted to death. And apparently for the ancient Israelites, that's how they perceived holy objects. Truly holy objects, hierophanous objects, objects touched by God, were so powerful that only designated human beings were supposed to handle them in designated ways, and that anybody who transgressed those rules could suffer death. And this is not the only time we see this. In the Hebrew Bible, we also have the infamous story of an Israelite who, with the best intentions, reaches up to prevent the Ark of the Covenant from sliding off of a cart. And because he touches the ark, and he is not someone who's supposed to be doing that, he is struck dead instantly. Not a reward or punishment per se, but simply a transgression of an essential rule. And again, like electricity, the handling of gas or the handling of water, these things are all beneficial, but they can turn on us. And apparently that's what happens here. So God, we know, is at the heart of all of this. But then we've just undergone, last night here in North Texas, a series of tornado warnings. There are certain inevitable forces in the world that can harm us, and we have to adapt to them, or they kill us. There's a reason why we call them acts of God. So I wish I could offer you a moral reason for why these two young men die. The rabbis struggle to do that, whether they're drunk, whether they were overly ambitious. They offer all kinds of rationales, but the truth of the matter is, I think in context, it's clear that they violated an essential ritual. They brought a wrong component, an alien fire, into the sacrifice, and it resulted in their death. So what I'm going to move over to is not so much the issue of their death, but the issue of how Moses and Aaron deal with their death. Because there are certain things about the world, about God, that we can't ultimately control, but what we can control is how we treat each other. And this is a hard moment because Aaron is struck silent by the sudden and catastrophic death of his two sons. And Moses' response is not exactly that of a compassionate brother. He basically chastises Aaron, saying, well, this is as God said, that you shall respect my holiness, etc., etc. And he quotes God, saying, well, these guys brought it upon themselves. Not the most pastoral moment, and certainly not what you expect from two brothers talking to each other after a catastrophic death. I guess once again we're reminded that even our great heroes sometimes fall short. And in particular, what's striking about this is that Moses offers Aaron a quote about what God's expectations are. that we've never seen before. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the Torah. This quote appears out of the blue. So it could be that, assuming that Moses has many more conversations than are recorded in the Torah with the God of Israel, that at some point or another God said this to him and it had been reported to everyone else. But we also have quite a number of cases in the Torah where Moses extends what God says or elaborates on what God says or says things in the name of God that we've never heard before. And elsewhere, the rabbis assume that Moses is arrogating upon himself the authority to speak for God, as it were, in an ambiguous situation. And most of the time that works really well. Actually, it tends to solve problems that aren't completely clear from a mitzvah. When a commandment is given directly by God, it's not self-evident, and Moses will say something that clarifies or makes it work better. But in this case, apparently Moses is offering an opinion from God that God didn't speak and is not useful. It's kind of cruel. And that comes to remind us that when we're mourners, or we're speaking, more importantly, we're speaking to mourners, we have to weigh our words very carefully. It's terrible enough that things happen that are awful and God is silent. But for the most part, we can deal with that. Far worse is when someone who intends to comfort us comes and says something that makes it much worse. And there's nothing worse than someone who arrogates to themselves the authority to speak on behalf of God at a time when we're suffering. This incident actually prefigures the entire book of Job, which tells the story of how a very righteous man, Job, is afflicted, not for any justifiable reason, for a test. And when his comforters come to him, initially they make the right judgment. They sit with him in silence. But then when they start talking to him about what's happened, they lapse into this idea of theodicy, that somehow they have to justify God's behavior. And the only way they can do that is by pointing at Job and saying, well, you must have done something wrong to deserve this. And what happens in the unfolding chapters afterwards is a series of exchanges between Job and his supposed comforters about the justice or injustice of what has happened to him. So Moses is guilty of the same behavior as Job's comforters, is that he tries to speak on behalf of God, thinking that somehow that will make things better, and it doesn't. So when in doubt, in a situation of mourning or crisis loss, better to stay silent than to make foolish rationales for what has happened. That's it. That's my Torah portion for Shemini this week. I'm going to be traveling to Cincinnati tomorrow to receive my doctorate, so I'll be there. I should be back Friday for services. That's my plan, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Of course, now we're heading into the final weeks before Pesach, our great holiday of liberation. So hope everyone is healthy and is preparing for the holiday and is ready to enjoy a joyous and liberating Pesach. And we'll see you next week.